So this is what a billion-dollar decision looks like when it's already been made without you. Ava Johnson said softly, her voice cutting through the polished silence of the boardroom as if it had been waiting there all along, her hand still extended midair, steady and patient, while Richard Whitmore glanced at it for half a second before pulling his own hand back with a faint, dismissive smile, the kind that never reached his eyes. And without a word he reached into his jacket, unfolded a crisp silk handkerchief, and wiped his palms slowly, deliberately, as if erasing the moment before it ever happened, and the room responded exactly as expected. Low laughter, restrained but sharp, echoing lightly against the glass walls and steel fixtures, a dozen executives shifting in their seats, some avoiding her gaze, others watching with quiet amusement. The power dynamic already decided before a single slide had been shown, but Ava didn't move, didn't blink, her fingers relaxed before she finally lowered her hand with measured calm, turning instead toward the screen behind her, the soft click of the remote sounding louder than it should have, like a trigger pulled in slow motion. And as the first slide illuminated the darkened room, casting a cool blue glow across the table, her reflection appeared faintly in the glass surface beneath them, composed, grounded, unshaken, while Richard leaned back in his chair, one arm draped casually over the leather, his posture signaling ownership of the space, of the outcome, of her place within it, or lack of it. And somewhere to the left a voice murmured, barely above a whisper, "Let's see what she's got," followed by a quiet chuckle. But Ava continued as if she hadn't heard a thing, her tone even, controlled, each word placed with precision. "Before I begin, I just want to understand something," she said, pausing just long enough for the room to shift, for the weight of attention to tilt back toward her. "Are you investing in vision, or just what feels familiar?" And for a moment no one answered, not because they didn't have one, but because the question itself didn't belong to the script they expected. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, not threatened, not yet, but curious in the way someone becomes when the predictable suddenly bends, and Ava let the silence breathe, let it stretch just enough before she turned back to the screen, her thumb pressing the remote again, the slide changing with a soft transition, numbers beginning to populate the space behind her, projections, charts, clean and undeniable, but still, the room held its distance, still anchored in quiet skepticism, still waiting for the misstep, the proof that she didn't belong. And Ava felt it all, the weight of every assumption pressing against the edges of the moment. But instead of pushing back, she stood taller within it, letting the light from the screen frame her silhouette, her presence no longer asking for permission, only time. And as the faint hum of the projector filled the air, something subtle shifted, not in the room, not yet, but in the space between certainty and what comes right before it breaks. The numbers settled onto the screen with quiet confidence, clean rows and measured projections stretching 12 months ahead, then 24, then 5 years, each figure grounded, each assumption documented. And still the room resisted, not with words but with posture, with the slight lean back of executives who had already decided what mattered and what did not. Richard Whitmore tapping a single finger against the armrest of his chair in a slow, almost rhythmic pattern as if marking time until the moment he could end. This politely, or not politely at all, while Ava Johnson stood within the glow of her own data, her expression unchanged, her voice steady as she moved from slide to slide, explaining not just growth but structure, not just opportunity but resilience. And somewhere halfway through a man near the far end of the table interrupted, his tone light, but edged with doubt, asking about risk exposure as if it were a formality, as if the answer would confirm what he already believed. And Ava turned slightly, acknowledging him with a small nod before answering in full, not rushed, not defensive, walking through contingencies, fallback positions, layered protections that had been built long before this meeting was ever scheduled. And for a brief second the man hesitated, not convinced, but no longer certain. And that hesitation passed through the room like a quiet ripple, subtle but real, while Richard shifted forward just enough to rest his elbows on the table, his interest sharpening, not in her, not yet, but in the edges of something he had not fully dismissed. And still he spoke with the same measured confidence, cutting in with a question that sounded more like a conclusion, pointing out that scale without backing meant nothing in this market. that numbers on a screen were not the same as capital in hand. And the room followed him again. A few nods, a few murmurs, the balance tilting back into familiar territory. But Ava did not interrupt, did not react. She simply listened until the room quieted again, until every eye returned to her. And then she stepped closer to the table, close enough that her reflection sharpened against the glass, her hand resting lightly on its surface, grounding the moment. And when she spoke again, her tone did not rise, did not push. It settled, deeper, clearer, as if everything before had only been preparation. "You are right," she said, and that alone caused a flicker of surprise, a break in expectation. "Scale without backing does not hold," she continued, her gaze steady across the room, not avoiding anyone now, not yielding to anyone either. "Which is why I did not come here to ask for it." And the sentence landed differently, not loud, not dramatic, but heavy in a way that pulled attention forward instead of pushing it away. Richard's fingers stopped tapping, the room stilled again, and Ava let that stillness sit for just a breath longer before she turned back to the screen, her thumb resting against the remote, not pressing it yet, not revealing anything yet, just holding the moment at its edge, where assumption meets something it cannot yet explain. And in that narrow space, for the first time since she had entered the room, the certainty that had filled it began to loosen just enough to let something else in the silence did not break. It tightened, stretching thin across the room as Ava Johnson finally pressed the remote, the screen shifting with a soft glow that felt louder than any voice. And for a split second nothing registered, just a new slide, clean, minimal, almost understated, until the number resolved in full clarity. $3 billion, fully committed capital, not projected, not pending, but secured, the kind of number that does not belong in speculation, the kind that changes posture before it changes words. And one by one the executives leaned forward without realizing it, eyes narrowing, scanning for the flaw that had to be there, because numbers like that did not appear without warning, not from someone they had already dismissed, not from someone they had laughed at minutes ago. And yet there it was, anchored with institutional names, verified commitments, dates, signatures, details too precise to ignore, and the room that had been so certain just moments before now searched for ground that was no longer where they left it. While Richard Whitmore did not move at first, his gaze fixed on the screen, not blinking, not reacting, but something in his stillness shifted, something tighter, more controlled, as if recalculating in real time. And Ava did not rush to explain. She let the silence work, let the weight of what they were seeing settle into the space, because this moment was not built on surprise, it was built on timing. And when she spoke again, her voice did not rise to meet the tension. It stayed exactly where it had always been, steady, grounded. "These commitments closed 12 hours ago," she said, each word landing clean, leaving no space for interpretation. "After your last deal lost 3 of its primary backers." And that was the second shift, quieter but sharper, because now it was not just about what she had, it was about what he had lost. And a few heads turned toward Richard without meaning to, the connection forming faster than anyone wanted to admit. And Ava continued, not pressing, not pausing, simply laying out the truth as it existed. "They were looking for something different," she said, her eyes moving across the room, meeting each hesitation without judgment. "Not safer, not louder, just clearer." And the word lingered, clearer, as if it applied to more than capital, more than strategy. And for the first time the room did not respond with doubt. It responded with quiet calculation, the kind that replaces dismissal when reality no longer matches expectation. And Richard finally shifted, pushing himself up from the chair in a motion that was slower than his usual confidence, his hand resting briefly against the table as he stood, not to steady himself, but to anchor the moment he had not planned for. His voice, when it came, measured, controlled, but no longer dismissive. "You are saying this is already done," he said, not as a challenge, but as a confirmation he needed to hear out loud. And Ava met his gaze without hesitation, without triumph, just presence. "I am saying you were never the gate," she replied, and the words did not echo. They settled, deep and irreversible, changing not just the deal on the table, but the understanding of who had been standing outside it all along. And in that stillness that followed, no one laughed, no one whispered, because the room had finally caught up to the truth that had been there from the beginning. They just had not seen it until it no longer needed them. The air in the room did not move. It settled into something heavier, something that no one could dismiss or laugh away. And Ava Johnson remained exactly where she stood, not advancing, not retreating, letting the weight of her words do what no argument ever could, while Richard Whitmore's gaze lingered on the screen for a moment longer before shifting back to her, recalculating, not just the numbers, but the moment itself, the missed signals, the assumptions he had treated as facts, and slowly, almost carefully, he stepped around his chair, the subtle shift in posture drawing every eye in the room, without a single word being spoken. Because this was not how he moved when he was in control. This was something else, something quieter, more deliberate. And when he stopped a few feet from her, the distance between them felt smaller than it had any right to, not because of space, but because of what had just changed within it, his hand rising slightly, not fully extended yet, not fully committed, as if even now he understood that the gesture carried more weight than it had minutes ago, and his voice followed, measured, restrained, stripped of the casual certainty it had carried before. "It seems I underestimated the situation," he said, the words chosen carefully, almost clinically, but the room heard what sat beneath them, because this was not about the situation, and Ava saw it too, the careful framing, the attempt to correct without fully acknowledging, and she did not interrupt, did not challenge. She simply held his gaze, steady and clear, allowing the silence after his words to stretch just long enough for their meaning to settle into the room. And when she finally responded, her voice did not rise to meet his. It remained grounded, unshaken. "You did not underestimate the situation," she said, each word placed with precision. "You just did not see me in it." And the distinction landed sharper than any accusation, because it did not attack. It clarified. It removed the distance he had tried to place between himself and the moment. And for the first time, Richard did not respond immediately, his hand lowering slightly, his posture shifting again, not defensive, not aggressive, but uncertain in a way that did not belong to him. And behind him the board remained silent. No one laughing now, no one whispering, because the power in the room had not disappeared, it had moved. And everyone could feel it, even if no one wanted to say it out loud. And Ava turned back to the screen, not to reclaim attention, but to complete what she had come to do, the next slide appearing with quiet clarity, outlining terms, structure, direction, not asking for approval, not seeking validation, simply presenting what already existed. And as the details unfolded, the room leaned in, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of necessity, because this was no longer a pitch, it was a position. And when she finished, she did not ask for questions, did not pause for feedback. She let the final image remain on the screen, the company name centered, clear, undeniable. And then she stepped back from the table, her hand brushing lightly against its surface as she turned toward the door. The movement calm, unhurried, as if the outcome had never depended on this room at all. And behind her, Richard remained where he stood, the space he once controlled now holding a silence he could not shape, watching as the door opened, the light from the hallway spilling briefly into the room, outlining her figure for just a second before she stepped through it. And when the door closed again, the sound was soft, almost weightless. But in the stillness that followed, it carried more finality than anything that had been said. The hallway outside felt cooler, quieter, the sharp echo of Ava Johnson's heels against the marble floor the only sound that followed her as she walked without looking back, her posture unchanged, her pace steady, as if nothing inside that room had touched her, and yet the weight of it lingered in the air behind her, sealed inside glass and steel where silence now pressed harder than any argument ever had. While inside, no one spoke at first, not because they had nothing to say, but because no one wanted to be the first to admit what had just happened. The screen still glowing faintly with her final slide, $3 billion anchored in numbers that refused to fade, and Richard Whitmore remained standing, his hand resting against the back of his chair now, not gripping, not claiming, just there, as if he needed something physical to hold on to while the room recalibrated around him. And slowly, one of the board members cleared his throat, a small, almost hesitant sound that broke the stillness just enough to let reality in. followed by another voice asking a question that no one had considered an hour ago, not about whether the deal was viable, but about whether they had just lost something they could not replace. And the shift was immediate, subtle but undeniable. Conversations no longer centered on dismissal but on consequence, on timing, on what it meant to have been outside of something this large without even realizing it. And Richard finally moved, stepping back from the table, his gaze drifting once more to the door that had already closed, the image of her standing there still sharp in his mind, not because of what she said, but because of what he had chosen not to see. And the realization did not come as a shock. It came as a quiet, steady pressure, the kind that builds when certainty cracks just enough to let truth through. And without raising his voice, without reclaiming the authority he once carried so easily, he spoke, not to the room, but almost to himself. Find out where she is going next. The instruction's simple, direct, but carrying something new beneath it. Not control, not command, but recognition. And around the table, heads nodded quickly now, not out of obligation, but urgency, because the opportunity had shifted, and they could feel it slipping further with every second they remained still. While down the hall, Ava stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding closed with a soft mechanical hum, sealing her inside a space that reflected her image back at her from every angle. The lights above casting a steady glow across her face, calm, composed, untouched by the tension she had left behind. And as the elevator began its descent, floor by floor, the city slowly rising into view through the glass wall opposite her, she allowed herself a single breath, deeper than the rest. Not relief, not release, just acknowledgment of a moment completed exactly as it needed to be, her hand resting lightly against the folder she carried, the edges worn from years of being overlooked, underestimated, dismissed, and now finally aligned with something undeniable. And as the numbers above the door ticked lower, each one marking distance from the room that had once defined the outcome, it became clear that the power had never been in that space at all. It had only ever been waiting for the moment it no longer needed permission to exist. The elevator doors opened to the quiet hum of the lobby, a wide expanse of polished stone and soft overhead lighting that reflected the late afternoon sun filtering through the glass walls. And Ava Johnson stepped forward without hesitation, her heels meeting the floor with a measured rhythm that echoed lightly in the open space. Not rushed, not slowed, just steady, as if each step had already been decided long before she entered that building. And outside, the city moved as it always did, cars passing in smooth lines, people crossing streets with purpose, unaware that somewhere above them a room had just shifted in a way that would ripple far beyond its walls. And as she reached the front doors, the glass panels sliding open with a quiet mechanical breath, a cool breeze met her, carrying the faint sounds of traffic and distant conversation, grounding the moment in something real, something larger than boardrooms and decisions. And she paused just for a fraction of a second on the threshold, not to look back, but to feel the space she had just left settle into memory, not as a victory, not as a confrontation, but as a confirmation. And then she stepped forward onto the sidewalk, the sunlight catching the edges of her silhouette, outlining her against the movement of the city, her reflection briefly visible in the glass behind her before it disappeared into the flow of everything else. And across the street, a black sedan idled quietly, its engine low, almost unnoticed, until the rear door opened and a man stepped out, not hurried, not aggressive, but deliberate, his suit simple, his posture composed. And Ava recognized him not by name but by presence, the kind that did not need introduction, and he approached with a calm respect that did not assume familiarity, stopping a few feet away, giving her space, his voice low but clear as he spoke, "Miss Johnson." And she turned slightly, meeting his gaze without surprise, without tension, just acknowledgment. And he continued, "They asked me to find you." The words careful, chosen, but carrying the weight of everything that had just unfolded upstairs. And for a brief moment, the noise of the street seemed to fade, replaced by a quieter understanding of what this moment represented, not pursuit, not pressure, but recognition arriving just a step too late. And Ava listened without interrupting, her expression unchanged, her hand resting lightly against the folder she still carried. And when he finished, She gave a small nod, not dismissive, not inviting, simply clear. "I am not hard to find," she said, her voice even, grounded in something that did not need to prove itself anymore. And the man paused, absorbing the simplicity of her answer, the absence of negotiation within it, before he inclined his head slightly, stepping back, not insisting, not pushing further, because something in her tone made it clear that the direction of this conversation would not be decided here, not on this sidewalk, not after everything that had already been set in motion. And as he returned to the car, the door closing softly behind him, Ava turned once more toward the city, her gaze moving forward, not scanning for what came next, but already aligned with it. And as she walked, blending into the rhythm of the street, the building behind her stood unchanged, glass and steel reflecting the sky, holding within it a room that had finally learned the difference between overlooking someone and missing them entirely. And in the quiet space between those two truths, something irreversible had already begun. The city carried on around her, steady and indifferent, but Ava Johnson moved through it with a quiet precision that no longer sought permission from any room she had left behind, her reflection briefly catching in the glass of passing storefronts before dissolving into motion again. And as she turned the corner onto a quieter street lined with older buildings and softer light, her phone vibrated once in her hand, a single notification that did not demand urgency, but carried weight all the same. And she glanced down, the screen illuminating with a name she recognized immediately, not from meetings or introductions, but from research, from patterns, from understanding where power actually shifted when it moved. And for a moment she did not answer, not because she hesitated, but because she chose when the moment would begin, letting the phone rest in her palm as she continued walking, her pace unchanged, her focus forward, until it vibrated again, not insistently, just present. And this time she answered, lifting it to her ear with the same calm she had carried all day, her voice steady as she spoke. "Ava Johnson." And on the other end, a pause, brief but noticeable, the kind that comes when expectation meets something different, followed by a voice older, measured, carrying the tone of someone accustomed to being heard the first time. "Miss Johnson, this is Daniel Mercer." And the name settled between them with quiet significance, because Daniel Mercer did not call without reason, did not reach without intention, and Ava listened without interruption as he continued, acknowledging the movement of capital that had already begun, referencing the commitments she had secured, the shifts that were now being felt across firms that had not yet caught up. And when he finished, there was no offer, not directly, just a space left open, deliberate, waiting to see how she would define it. And Ava stopped walking then, not abruptly, just enough to stand still beneath the shade of a tall building, the sunlight breaking around her in soft edges. And she looked ahead, not at anything specific, but at the direction that had already been set in motion. And when she spoke, her words were simple, unembellished. "If you are calling to catch up, you are already late," she said, not as a challenge, not as dismissal, just truth delivered without weight. And on the other end, there was no offense, only a quiet acknowledgment, the kind that does not argue because it recognizes something it cannot shift. And Daniel's voice returned, slightly different now, not diminished, but adjusted. "Then tell me where this goes next." And the question did not seek control, it sought alignment, a subtle but critical difference. And Ava allowed herself a breath. Not hesitation, just clarity settling into place. "It goes where it always should have," she replied, her tone even, grounded, forward. And the word carried more than direction. It carried decision. It closed what needed closing without raising its voice. And when the call ended, she lowered the phone, the screen fading back to black. And for a moment the street around her felt quieter, not because the world had changed, but because something within it had found its place without needing to be recognized. And as she resumed walking, the rhythm of her steps steady once more, the path ahead no longer shaped by doors that opened or closed for her, but by something far simpler, far stronger, the certainty that she had never been outside the room at all, only ahead of it, waiting for the moment it finally understood. The light had shifted by the time Ava Johnson reached the corner cafe, the late afternoon sun stretching long reflections across the windows, turning glass into mirrors that caught fragments of movement, fragments of faces, fragments of a day that had already begun to change more than one direction. And she stepped inside without hesitation, the soft chime of the door barely noticed as the quiet hum of conversation and the low rhythm of espresso machines filled the space, grounding everything in something ordinary, something untouched by billion-dollar decisions and silent boardrooms. And she moved toward the counter, ordered simply, her voice steady, her tone unchanged, as if nothing about her day required explanation. And when her coffee was placed in front of her, she took it with a small nod, her fingers wrapping around the warmth of the cup, anchoring her in the present moment before turning toward the window, choosing a seat that faced the street, where the city continued to move without pause. And for a moment she allowed herself to sit, not to rest, but to observe, to let the rhythm of everything outside align with the rhythm she had already set within. And across the glass, reflections layered over reality, passing cars blending with her own still figure, a quiet contrast between motion and certainty. And her phone remained still on the table, no longer vibrating, no longer calling her back into spaces that had already been decided, because what needed to reach her already had, and what came next would not arrive through urgency, but through alignment. And as she lifted the cup, the warmth steady in her hands, the door behind her opened again, the same soft chime cutting through the low conversation, and without turning, she already knew, not from sound, not from movement, but from the subtle shift in the air that followed presence. With intent, and a few steps approached, measured, controlled, stopping just within the edge of her space, not too close, not too far. And then his voice came, lower than before, stripped of performance. "Miss Johnson." And she turned her head slightly, meeting Richard Whitmore's gaze not with surprise, but with recognition, because this moment was not unexpected, it was simply delayed. And he stood there without the distance of a boardroom, without the structure that had once defined him, his posture quieter, his presence more deliberate, as if the space between them now required something different than authority. And for a brief second, neither spoke, the city continuing behind the glass, the cafe holding its quiet rhythm around them. And then Richard extended his hand, not halfway, not uncertain, but fully this time, open, steady, offering not control, but acknowledgment. And the gesture carried everything that had not been said upstairs, everything that had been missed in a single moment now returned with clarity. And Ava looked at his hand, not evaluating, not judging, simply seeing it for what it was. And when she lifted her gaze back to his, her expression remained calm, unchanged, grounded in something that did not need correction. And when she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. "You see me now," she said, not as a question, not as an accusation, just truth placed between them. And Richard did not look away, did not retreat. He nodded once, slowly, the motion small but real, and for a moment the space between them held something new, not tension, not victory, but understanding that had arrived later than it should have. And Ava let that moment exist exactly as it was, complete without needing to extend it further, her hand still resting around the warmth of her cup, her posture unchanged, her presence steady. And then, without reaching for his hand, without dismissing it either, she returned her gaze to the window, to the movement of the city beyond, because some gestures are not meant to be accepted or rejected, only understood. And in that quiet space, the difference became clear to both of them. Richard Whitmore's hand remained extended for a moment longer, steady but no longer commanding, suspended in a space that no longer belonged to him. And then slowly, without tension, without embarrassment, he lowered it, not as a retreat, but as an understanding, because some gestures are not returned in the way they are offered. And he seemed to recognize that now, standing beside the small cafe table, where power no longer echoed, but settled into something quieter, something more real. And Ava Johnson did not look back at him immediately, her gaze still resting on the movement beyond the glass, the steady rhythm of a city that had never paused for approval, her reflection faint against the window, layered over passing cars and shifting light. And in that reflection, there was no trace of the moment upstairs, no shadow of laughter, no imprint of dismissal, only presence, grounded and complete. And after a few seconds, she stood, not abruptly, not with finality, just with intention, lifting her coffee cup and placing it gently back onto the table. The soft sound barely noticeable, but enough to mark the shift, and when she turned, she faced him fully this time, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, and for the first time, the distance between them held no imbalance, no silent hierarchy, only two people standing in the same space, seeing each other without assumption. And Richard spoke again, quieter now, his voice carrying less certainty but more truth. "I should have listened sooner," he said, the words simple, unguarded, and Ava held his gaze for a moment, not evaluating, not correcting, just acknowledging what had been said without needing to expand it. And when she responded, her voice carried no weight of judgment, no need to teach or remind. "You heard what you were ready to hear," she said, the words soft but clear, and something in them settled deeper than apology, because they did not place blame, they placed understanding. And Richard nodded once, slowly, as if accepting not just the moment, but the time it had taken to arrive there, and neither of them spoke after that, not because there was nothing left, but because what mattered no longer required words. And Ava stepped past him then, not brushing against him, not avoiding him, simply moving forward, her path uninterrupted, her direction unchanged. And as she reached the door, the soft chimes sounded again, the same quiet note that had marked his arrival, now marking her departure. And the sunlight met her once more, warm and steady, wrapping around her as she stepped back into the flow of the street, her figure blending into motion, not disappearing, but becoming part of something larger than any room could contain. And behind her, Richard remained where he stood for a moment longer, not watching her leave in regret, not frozen in realization, but still grounded in a silence that no longer needed to be filled. And outside, the city carried her forward, step by step, into a space where recognition was no longer something to be earned, but something that followed naturally, quietly, inevitably. And as the reflection in the cafe window shifted once more, catching only light and movement where she had stood, the moment closed not with a statement, not with a victory, but with something far more lasting. The quiet certainty that what had once been overlooked had never been absent at all.